Welcome back. Now we have Federica Casarosa from the Center of Judicial Cooperation. As you know, today we are, our conference, the panels in our conference, and in particular, the next two panels are organized in collaboration with the Center for Judicial Cooperation within the UI. So I leave the floor to Federica Casarosa from the Center for Judicial Cooperation that will introduce these two sessions.
I will just introduce the Center for Judicial Cooperation. I will only make you spend 3 minutes on the center. This is a newly created center at the UI. It's since 2011 that has been created and is directed by Professor Fabrizio Cafaggi and by Professor Loïc Zoulet. They are both professors at the UI. I'm just a representative for them. I'm a research fellow at the UI, so I'm collaborating with the center, and we have the objective of making together and allowing the academic community to communicate and to debate around the very important issues that you already have developed this morning with judges, so with those that will provide remedies for the problems that has been raised, and to interpret the laws and the rules that this morning were severely criticized by several professors. So it's important for us to make sure that we have this direct dialogue with judges, with those that will apply the laws. So just as an advertising for the center, we are looking for working papers and for publications that you are interested to present. So feel free to contact us to have your working papers that is connected with the judicial dialogue on several issues. In this sense, and to engage in debate also with us. So please visit our webpage that is in the Department of Law and see what we are doing and what would be interesting for you. So this is the end of my advertisement, and I leave the floor to those that will look at substance.
Thank you, Federica, for your presentation. And welcome to everybody for this panel. First of all, let me thank the European University Institute for inviting me to moderate this panel that deals with a challenging topic, the systemic and organization failure in highly and automated systems embedding novel and advanced technology, in the context of the conference theme that is legal and social impact of automated system in aviation. On behalf of the European University Institute, I thank also the distinguished panelists that have accepted to take part of the conference. Previous panels have examined some very key issues, the lesson learned from CESAR, the liability, responsibility, and insurance in RPAS, the ACAX problem, ACAS, and the liability for innovative technology. The entire conference is based on a paradigm shift, the possible shift liability for accidents from operator to technology, that is, from operators to organizations, technology manufacturers, system developers, and other entities which are involved in building, developing, updating, and testing the particular technology. So we have software, we have hardware, and I would add also orgware. This raises some legal issues. First of all, the problem to balance individual liability and organizational liability. The need to determine how different degrees of autonomy of agents and machines shape the liability of the different actors, operators, controllers, manufacturers, designers. The study of dynamic transfer of responsibility due to forthcoming operational concepts and procedures, like, for example, the aircraft trajectory of César concept, self-separation. In the previous panel, Ugo Pagallo has given us a clear picture of different kinds of liabilities. The work of previous panels led us to the problems raised by systemic organizational failure in highly automated systems, embedding novel and advanced technology. That is the subject of our panel. The questions in this field are numerous. Do exist laws and regulations that provide an adequate normative framework for liabilities in highly automated systems? Is the resulting allocation of responsibility an effective means to prevent accident and to increase the level of safety and performance? How forthcoming operational concept and procedure provide challenges in the involvement of different actors and their consequent responsibilities. The presentation and discussions of our panel starts from the point of view of the judicial authority, designed to ascertain the responsibilities of failures in automated systems that have caused damage as a consequence of an accident. The cases that Pierpaolo Gori, judge at the Milan court, will present to show both organizational and systemic failure. He will tell us how the judicial authority has faced allocation of liability in some actual cases. I raise a further question. In every European member state, there is a national air safety agency delegated to investigate an air accident and incident accidents. In the civil law countries, opening two investigations by the judicial authority and the safety agency could create overlapping and competence conflict. How does the judicial authority see this problem? And so, Dr. Gori, the floor is yours.
I would like to thank the European University Institute for this invitation, namely Professor Giovanni Sartori and Dr. Giuseppe Contissa, and as well Dr. Alfredo Roma for this presentation. I'm so sorry that I could not attend the workshop yesterday and early this morning to follow part of the discussion, because I think that really it could be important also to listen for an exchange, because I have the feeling that really sharing a common culture in those issues related with aviation is so important because of many international aspects involving regulation and following judgments. However, I will present just a few cases under both the civil and the criminal corner. Oh yeah, we have a few diapos to follow. Thank you. To follow maybe easily. Yeah. And maybe we have not time to discuss every detail about all 5 cases, but just it's interesting not really to go deeply to explain the dynamic of accidents and failures. Many of them are very famous, you are experts, and really, I guess, you know most part of them. It's maybe more useful to take a different perspective and to go strictly in technical terms to see how, in the court's perspective, a conduct, usually a culpable conduct, is relevant, and when a causal nexus is established between the conduct and the harmful event. In those cases, you already know that are very rare cases of willing conduct. Many of them are relevant only because there is a culpability and there are regulations that give relevance not only to actions, but to non-actions too. Let's start from the first one. In the Linate disaster, the main provision applicable was a provision from the criminal code for multiple aeronautic manslaughter and for culpable conduct. The burden of proof in those cases, under Article 40, paragraph 2 of the criminal code, tells that liability may depend not only upon action, but upon specific obligations, under specific obligation, upon a failure to take an action if necessary to avoid the harmful effect. Following a process of mental elimination, judges just try to find if an action or a non-action is conditio sine qua non for the event. So the question to be answered is this one. Would the event have occurred without such action, of course, in the case of a positive action? In that case, the evidence results underlined a chain of situations, procedures, and instruments that failed to ensure safety of the flight. For example, the former head of the Air Traffic Control Authority and the former general manager of ENAV were held liable for negligent behavior concerning replacement of a ground radar that was out of service for near 2 years before the accident. This is a case where really organizational aspects are very important because there is a long chain of command leading to the front operator, and only a precise and clear procedure and organization can prevent effectively from a risk of human errors. Of course, there was also a liability of the airport operator and of the air traffic controller, but it's interesting maybe to notice that the position of the air traffic controller was held and judged less harshly than the heads of the organizational process. Civil damages followed the criminal conviction, but it's maybe to point out that civil proceedings did not end with a judgment because of a friendly settlement. It means that really culpability and the causal nexus were so clear that there was no need for a judgment. In another famous case, the Tuninter air crash, again, I guess that maybe facts are already known. In a few words, there was an aircraft that ditched into the sea 23 nautical miles from the closest airport of Palermo because there was a lack of fuel. Again, the main provision applicable is the same Article 449, paragraph 2 of the Criminal Code. But here the burden of proof to investigate is rather related to non-actions, and namely the question to be answered is, would the event have occurred with the prescribed action? And it's interesting to focus even on the second paragraph of Article 41, which provides that the causal link is anyway interrupted by unforeseen subsequent circumstances that alone are sufficient to generate the harmful event. This is important because when we have a long organizational chain, of course, theoretically, many persons could be involved. But of course, there are events so important that can interrupt and break this chain. To be short, evidence results underline three major problems. First of all, there was a human mistake because the relevant fuel quantity indicator was fault. There was a replacement with the wrong part just before the flight, and therefore pilots, when refueled the aircraft, were not aware of the quantity of fuel inside the tankers. However, it's interesting to know that there was a lack of organization in this replacement because investigation showed that a wrong database was used without license and without a specific training, so that the heads of the mechanical department of the air company did not provide safe procedures to find the right parts. And finally, the mechanic did not apply a prescribed control that should take place after the inventory finding. Secondly, there was, of course, a fault indicator device operating. And in this case, when the aircraft was insufficiently refueled, there was a chance for the pilots to understand exactly the quantity inside the tankers, and they failed to adopt the right procedures to do so. There was a need for ask for a prescribed fuel receipt, and this was mandatory, but it was not asked, and therefore pilots did not confront the receipt results with the wrong indicator amounts of fuel reported. Thirdly, there was an human error when really the mistake and the fault became evident, because when the aircraft was closer to Palermo, pilots and the crew, in general speaking, succumbed to panic, trying to restart the engines. Of course, without success, there was not enough fuel inside the aircraft. But there was a procedure to follow in those cases to reach the closest airport and to try to use as much as possible updrafts. In this case, just the other way around, the pilot and the co-pilot just tried a solution for a landing, an accidental landing, ditching closer to a ship seeking for help. The ruling underlined the main responsibility of the pilot because of human error and overconfidence on automated indicators. He had the chance to understand that the machine told wrong numbers. Then there was, again, a liability of the top organizational bodies of the air company for lack of organization, and there was a specific liability of the head of the maintenance department and the mechanical foreman and mechanic who replaced the part. It's interesting to see that the causal nexus under the criminal corner is very often used even under the civil corner, not only for chronological reasons, because criminal proceedings start immediately, and then normally civil proceedings follow, but even because the provisions of the criminal code, like, for example, in the German system, are used even by civil judges. Of course, the burden of proof in civil proceedings is different. Let's see very quickly a few cases, if we have time enough.
Yes, it's okay. For the moment, it's okay.
Okay. Let's take an interesting case of bird strikes. Of course, for many pilots, bird strikes are a kind of nightmare because they can occur while taking off normally, and normally remote controllers or other technical devices do not notice very precisely and underline such a problem. In this case, we have a very heavy aircraft that, while taking off, collided with a storm of seagrass. There was an engine stall and a subsequent emergency landing of the aircraft with consistent damages. Here, the court adopted the provision of the Article 2015 Civil Code, civil liability for dangerous activity. What does it mean? It means that applicants and the court as well shared the same view, thinking that operating an airport is really a dangerous activity. What does it mean? It means that there is a specific need for adoption of all suitable methods for preventing incidents, and in this specific case, this burden was even more heavy because there was a landfill close to the coastal airport. I guess those are really the worst conditions for bird strikes, because a landfill could attract birds. In the specific case, the evidence provided mainly by the court expert underlined that the government and the airport authorities tried to prevent the accident. There was a specific committee operating, and there were good dispersal devices operating at that time. So the expert was likely to consider the accident really accidental. It was really something unforeseeable. However, the court disregarded this point of view because it gave relevance to the human monitoring which had to work matching with technical devices like remote monitoring. It was not enough for the court to rely on indicators that could be wrong and prove in the specific case to be wrong, or to just formal remedies like, for example, alerts that were not specifically used and followed by the crews and by the controllers. So the airport operator was held responsible for 35% of damage compensation because it failed to adopt suitable harassment tools, over-relying on automated devices. Let's think that human armed patrols for bird strikes are used in several international airports, like in the case of the Copenhagen airport. So there were best practices that could be followed. The ENAV authority was responsible for 35% of damage compensation for not having complied to its duties concerning flight safety, for not having instructed and effectively monitored its controls. Again, formal procedures are not enough. It's necessary to prove to have organized trainings, seminaries, workshops, and concrete experiences to be sure that the knowledge is effectively used. Ministry of Transport was responsible for 22.5% of damage because of lack of control over its peripheral structures. And anyway, this case underlines how even under the civil corner, the organization is so important and normally really is the main key factor to understand if there is a liability. Because operating airports and aircrafts is one of the most complex activities, more than, for example, liabilities in surgery, where anyway an individual position is not enough to understand if there is a damage and a liability, because there is a complex organization involving the whole hospital, more and more in the case of aircrafts and airports, there are several levels of controls, and therefore it's very easy that a liability of the heads is detected. Let's take another case. In the case of technical defects of the airplane not underlined by manuals, the Court of Milan delivered a judgment finding that the pilot was free of charges because, at least in this case, there was no specific liability. To be very short, there were very different provisions that the applicants adopted. However, the court thought that theoretically only a non-contractual liability was possible in the specific case because no contract was signed, and therefore no contractual liability provisions from the Italian regulation and from international regulation like Warsaw or Montreal Conventions were applicable. It means that the burden of proof is really, really heavy, and the damaged have to give evidence to faults of the pilot and then to the existence of a causal nexus between conduct and armed event, and of course of the measure of damages. The court was not satisfied with the effort of the applicants to give evidence of a culpable conduct in this specific case, because, again, a technical report from a parallel criminal proceeding underlined that there was really a failure, a technical failure in fueling the aircraft while the airplane was below 1,000 feet. But this technical problem was not detected by the instrumentation in the cockpit and was not underlined by the manuals. So the designer and the manufacturer were not part of the proceedings, and the pilot was not liable for such a defect. And witnesses and, again, technical reports give evidence that his activity was absolutely in the standard required. The final case that I selected for you comes from the Court of Venice, and it's about damages coming from lack of maintenance of the airport's infrastructure. Here we have a small airport where there was an insufficient maintenance of the infrastructure. And the damage consisted in repairing an airliner that was damaged by a part of the runway surface, broken under pressure from the landing gears that hit the body. The provision is applicable was 2051 Civil Code, liability for lack of custody, because it was held that there was a specific contract for custody of the infrastructure that led to specific positive obligations on the airport operator, a private one. And in the specific case, we have even a liability of the public administration, namely the Ministry of Defense, because he was too substantially a kind of airport operator ex lege, according to the law, although the airport was mainly used by private operators. Let's go quickly to conclusions. The case law overview shows that the failures of automated systems and human errors in aviation accidents and incidents are often enchained, and I guess that this is not this is already known. But it's interesting to know that operating an airport, an aircraft, as long as it is considered a complex and dangerous activity, involves a wide number of subjects with different roles, and therefore, very often we have concurring liabilities. Organizational procedures and effective supervisory activity have to provide reliable and adequate support for the frontline operators to limit the risk of human errors that are, of course, possible, but are not excluded or not exclusive in most cases. Irrelevant conduct, normally a culpable one, is usually not excluded by automation and may lead both to civil and criminal liabilities. And a causal nexus between this conduct and event may involve the whole chain of command that failed to organize adequately safety procedures and controls, following the already described process of mental elimination. Of course, there are limits in establishing such liability. The nexus is interrupted by subsequent exclusive circumstances that alone generated the event. Under the criminal corner, provisions normally give relevance to culpable conducts, and interpretations of the causal nexus give relevance to non-actions, and positive obligations are extensive in air transport regulations. And under the civil corner, the burden of proof in most cases is not very heavy because of specific provision coming from conventions and specific internal provisions. I guess that really I took maybe a long time for this presentation, but I would just now to give a floor to the other speakers.
Thank you, Pierpaolo, for your presentation. It was quite interesting, presenting a few well-known cases. The first of all is Linate, where you put in result the fact that also the lack of action can create a liability. The case of Tunisair, that was very trivial reason. It was the operator that didn't match the part number and the serial number of the fuel indicator. And also the organizational lack, plus in the end, the pilot's mistake for the emergency landing. The case of Genoa with another organizational failure in complex activity like that of managing an airport. The Cessna case that is even different in the negligence in the design of the aircraft and in the manual that led the pilot to make a mistake in changing the fuel reservoir. And then finally the Treviso case, where there is a lack of custody of the runway and other infrastructure of the airport. And was quite interesting so that in all cases you raised the problem of causal nexus. That is certainly one of the key points for establishing the liability in these difficult and complex cases where many events occur because an air accident is never caused by one reason only, but is a series of mistakes, a series of negligences, a series of failure that can be technical or organization. Aviation accidents normally happen during navigation or ground taxiing. We all remember that Tenerife, the biggest accident happened for the aviation, where two jumbos collided in Tenerife. Therefore, air traffic management is always involved in aviation accidents. Today, we will listen to the opinion of Eurocontrol as responsible of air traffic management and the voice of the air traffic controllers, represented by IFATCA. They will tell us how they see the progressive introduction of the state of the art at the moment and the progressive introduction of automated system in aviation, in particular in air traffic management that is going to change with the CESAR implementation. And there is a particular project, SWIM, that foresees the introduction of information regarding the trajectory of the plane by many actors that can be in the future responsible for wrong information introduced in the system. That is a particular case because also SWIM is based on new technologies. Regrettably, there is not today the pilot's voice that have already a 20 years experiment of a fly-by-wire. That was the introduction of automated system. I wish to remember that Eurocontrol has produced a study on resilience that is an instrument to develop models and methods to improve an organization's ability to succeed under varying conditions, thereby enhancing both safety and daily operations. Air traffic management is among the socio-technical systems that have developed so rapidly, requiring therefore a continuous flexibility to adapt to the new technologies. Even in these fields, questions are many. What levels of skills and care may be required by operators of highly automated innovation technologies? Who is liable when human active errors and latent technical and organizational errors merge together? Who is responsible when operators defectively make up for non-performing automated systems? Will these be treated as organizational, automation, or human failures? Who is responsible for the behavior of systems that humans cannot fully monitor and control? Who is responsible for information supplied by automated systems that the human cannot verify? The case I mentioned before. Who is responsible when operators fail to cope with emergencies involving degraded automation? Last question. What have you, Eurocontrol, learned from the Überlingen and Air France 447 accident? So we start with Radu Choponea, project manager for the Just Culture project. And that is the other item that is coming out, the Just Culture, very important subject. Eurocontrol, in Eurocontrol, responsible for the organization and implementation of air traffic control. Radu, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alfredo. Good morning, everybody. And of course, first of all, thank you very much to the organizers for putting all this together, which remains obviously an extremely important thing. And we are glad to be represented here, a number of us from Eurocontrol, to be part of this. I have decided to not present any slides today. Usually I spend my life between two presentations, so for a change I thought that I would prefer people to either look into their own laptops, which they usually do, or look at me and listen to what I have to say. So the choice is yours. Hopefully what I'm going to say is interesting enough. I would like to follow on from the previous speaker because those were very, very good examples And this is one aspect that, at least the part that of the conference that I was able to follow, was not really discussed. There was a lot of discussion about civil proceedings, about compensation, about all that, but I didn't hear much about the criminal liability, about the criminal responsibility. And in Eurocontrol, the activities around just culture that we are doing try to focus quite a bit on the criminal liabilities. If there was no criminal liability, I believe that if nobody was threatened by, let's say, threatened by by the potential for a criminal indictment, will probably not need just culture, at least not at the level outside the organization. I would just like to clarify the fact that I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a judge or a prosecutor. I'm part of that odd community here. We are a few engineers. I also used to be an air traffic controller, and I'm a private pilot, so I don't know much about litigation. I don't know much about the courts and the way they function. And so I only look at it from a technical perspective, because obviously the way we develop, I used to be a system developer as well, so the way we develop those systems, the way we think about automation is always with the best intentions, and we do our best to eliminate the mistakes from any errors, any embedded not good functionality, so to speak, to eliminate that from design. So we believe in the safety by design concept. However, human error was mentioned a couple of times by Pierpaolo, and obviously we are never free from that, because as it happens, we're all humans. So we're humans when we design systems, we're human when we use systems, we're human even when we debug systems from the errors that were found either in the design or in the operation of the systems. And here I would like to try to hit the nail on the head with the error during the design and operation of the systems, because it is often said that in aviation the vast majority of accidents happen because of human error. So at the end of the day, it's the poor guy who flies the poor aircraft who has made an error and has crashed and killed so many people. A criminal. So what we try to do, let's try to eliminate that human error. What's the best way to eliminate the human error? Well, we could try to train, but of course pilots don't always listen, nor do the controllers. They still remain human, so let's try to replace them by a robot, by a machine, by some automation. You know, it is one of the jokes that is going around that the aircraft of the future will have as a crew a pilot and a dog. The pilot will be there to feed the dog, and the dog will be there to bite the pilot if he tries to touch anything in the aircraft. So in this case, I guess eventually the dog will be liable if anything happens, because he didn't manage to stop the pilot in time from touching the aircraft. Problem solved. But indeed, this is a serious issue that systems are constantly changing. Sometimes we feel, and of course Mark, who is an active controller, will talk about that and can testify to that, that we seem to be playing a catch-up game all the time, because technology is advancing, and of course all of us play the same catch-up game at home, in our private lives, in office, with the technology that we are showered with. You buy anything today on the market, be it a telephone, television set at home, a car, within a few weeks it's obsolete. Something else has bettered that product. And to some extent the same thing happens in aviation, although at a slower speed. but there is a massive amount of new technology, new concepts, new procedures that are constantly arriving. And the humans who are involved there from the design phase, from the conceptual design, manufacturing, operation phase, they're also trying to play catch up with the advance of the technology. And when something goes pear-shaped, of course, they may have to pick up the pieces and pay the consequences. In this context, what we believe it is absolutely crucial, of crucial importance, continues to be of a crucial importance, even if the role of the human in the first line as a controller or a pilot, or indeed a mechanic or an engineer, may somewhat diminish, or rather may somewhat change. Reporting remains an absolute essential part of safety, because only through this kind of combination between reactive and proactive safety we can try to minimize, at the minimum, minimize the potential for disasters, things like 447, Überlingen, Linate. I mean, these are all very, very loud names, loud words that gets everybody's attention. We can try to eliminate those. Hopefully, we can manage to eliminate, and touch wood, since Überlingen, we did not have any other accident with direct ATM implication. And I believe since the Spanair crash in Madrid, there wasn't any other fatal accident with commercial air transport in Europe. The United States equally did not have one since the Buffalo crash, so we seem to be doing reasonably well in the Western world. Of course, less so in other areas of the planet. But coming back to the reporting and the just culture, why is just culture important? Because, again, we need to be able to identify as soon as possible any mistakes, any errors, any slips, lapses that may exist in the system. And when I say system, I mean the overall system, which includes as you said, Alfredo, the hardware, the software, the orgware. In the orgware, of course, I would include the liveware. So the human operators, the human designers, manufacturers, and operators of those systems. And none of those wares are perfect. None of those wares are without fault. Some of the faults are visible, known, so we try to find workarounds. And this is precisely where we're looking at in terms of resilience, which you mentioned. Very often the human is considered as the weak link in the system. Through the resilience project, we actually turn the argument around and say, well, in fact, the human is the strong link in the system. Not only because it's somewhat strange that we look at automation like it was an alien thing, like somebody came from outside and gave it to us. It's still human-made. But in considering the humans as the strong link in the system, we're actually looking at the way humans constantly adapt. A system, an automated or mechanical system, is very much rigid. To a large extent, it's rigid. It has been designed in a certain way. Even if some of them have a certain flexibility, that's a flexibility that functions within certain parameters. And it would seldom go outside those parameters and continue to function as expected. The same thing happens with procedures, which also were designed by people. They are meant to function in a certain way, in a certain environment, which not very often match, the reality not very often matches the the designed parameters. In all those situations, it's the human who is the frontline operator who will adapt, who will face the variability, who will be able to iron out the wrinkles in the system and make the system function. So we're looking at the human not as a source of, a potential source of errors, of mistakes, of failures. Quite on the contrary, we're looking at the human as a potential source of solutions when things don't go as expected. And we're working in this with a number of universities, with a number of professors who are also, who have done quite a lot of work on the reliability issue. And so we're looking at the differences between work as imagined, and that's the design of either the hardware, the software, the procedures, and work as done. Because the two are almost never the same. Coming back to the just culture, which is an integral part of this approach, it is important that people, that frontline operators, feel confident in coming forward and reporting their own mistakes. Usually they are confident in reporting someone else's mistakes. So if this microphone didn't function, so I would have kept pressing on the button, it didn't function, I would immediately jump up and say, hey, this is rubbish. You gave me a system that doesn't work. It's badly designed, it's broken. If I pressed, say, here, trying to turn it on, and then I realized, oh, the button is actually there, I'm the stupid one, I wouldn't necessarily jump up and say, hey, people, you see, I'm really dumb. I didn't see the button, the green button to turn on the microphone. That happens, that naturally happens to everybody. Their own mistakes are naturally not necessarily reported, and their mistakes might be, in the vast majority of cases, not because they come to work to make a mistake, not because they have the intention of doing something wrong, but because somewhere in the system there may be a failure. Maybe there was something in their design, in the system's design, maybe there was something in the people's training, and we saw in the previous cases, we saw some issues with the training. Maybe there was a lack of information, such as the Cessna case. The pilot was unaware because nobody had ever told him, nobody has ever trained him on this. The manual did not mention that. He did not have the information that there were previous cases with that, which would have probably raised a question mark to him. So it is very important that people would feel confident in coming forward and report those errors, those mistakes, without the fear for punishment, without the fear that they would suffer any damage, any detriment in their job, in their private lives, without the fear of losing face. So we are discussing of roughly two different just cultures, if I can say so. There is an organizational just culture, in the sense that the organization would not punish that individual, in the sense that generally the peers and the management would encourage this kind of reporting, would not point to that individual who might have made a mistake, and would protect, maybe even ideally would protect the identity of whoever reported that mistake. So this is at an organizational level, which is probably something relatively easy to, relatively easy to obtain, because by and large it only depends on the organization. There is another aspect of just culture, and that's the legal issue. And we are faced with legislation in a number of countries in Europe. Well, basically every single country would have a legislation that would require, that would forbid the harm of others. Virtually every single country has a legislation that would ensure the safety of public transport, that would require that public transport is safe. So there is a concern on the part of the frontline operators that in case of a mistake on their part, in case of an incident, let alone an accident, when there is damage, where there may be injury, even in a case of an incident, they may be held responsible, they may be held liable for having endangered the lives of others or having endangered the public transport. I believe Switzerland has such a law, for example. So in the work that we are doing in Eurocontrol, we have for many, many, many years, and Mark and I believe we have met the first time something like 20 years ago on this very subject. So we have been working on the organizational just culture, but we have, for many, many, many years, we have been discussing this within the aviation circles, not being able to reach out to the representatives of the judiciary. And it is something that we have finally managed to achieve a couple of years ago. And we are, I would say, quite successfully now touring Europe and bringing to Brussels judges, prosecutors, lawyers, and when I'm talking about lawyers, these are not the lawyers from any aviation or ATC organization. Most of them usually deal with contractual issues or personnel staff issues. They're not necessarily specialized in this particular issue. And anyway, they do not have, yes, they do not have any influence on that. So. Yes, I would close with saying that it is important for us to bridge the gap between aviation safety and the administration of justice, and it is important for the future to continue to have that reporting culture, to be able to identify the issues in the systems, no matter how automated they are. Thank you.
Thank you, Rado. Sorry for making some pressure on you, and thank you for your presentation. You recalled us that more or less 70% of the air accidents are caused by human errors. But anyway, the accident in the last 15, 20 years have diminished from 5 per million flights to 2 per million flights. So the introduction of new technology, especially fly-by-wire, and also a new technology in air traffic control that have reduced the workload of human beings, of the operators, have helped to reduce this ratio in accident. I remember a nice joke when after some years that fly-by-wire was introduced, that there was an aircraft on the taxiway, and the tower says, Air France 227 ready for line up and take off. And he says, just a minute, I asked the system. But anyway, this automation has become very helpful to this result. And the next step will be when we will have eventually implemented the SESAR, the single European sky, but the single European sky that foresees the reduction of the air traffic control centers from 58 to 22 more or less, and the introduction of the new and homogeneous hardware for the air traffic control all over Europe. You came in the end, and the rest would be made by just culture, and you rightly distinguished the organizational just culture that is easier to realize among the organizations, and the other one that is the legal just culture that implies the involvement also of the judicial side. Of course, judges in many cases will defend saying that we are obliged, that we have a compulsory criminal prosecutors to open when we know of a crime. But nevertheless, I think that also in this way, in this part, something should be done in the future. We now listen the voice of counterpart, to some extent, of Eurocontrol, that is IFATCA, representing their traffic controllers responsible for the actual air traffic management in daily operations. IFATCA has produced in 2014 a technical and professional manual that inter alia affirms that automated systems must be built with an integrity factor that assures uncorrupted data. The controllers cannot be considered responsible if the data are corrupted. The human factor must be considered when developing automated systems. We rely to the designer liability, the producer liability, the controller liability, etc. And the controller must remain anyway the key element of air traffic control system. In the end, the questions are the same raised for Eurocontrol. Mark, the floor is yours.
So thank you for inviting me. While we put that on the full screen, I would like just to make a little bit of PR following what Radu said on the end in Just Culture. It's, we have training courses now organized jointly between Eurocontrol, IFATCA, the International Federation of Air Traffic Control Association, and the European Cockpit Association, the pilots, where we have training for prosecutor experts, so where we have prosecutors in the room who have never heard of Just Culture, so we explain that to them, and they explain to us the reality of law, the administrative justice, and we have a round table where we discuss, train each other in the respective roles, and that has been an eye-opener. So we have been meeting, as Radu said, 20, I think it's rather 25 years, and we have always said you have to be just, you have to be just, but actually there's something out there. We never actually tried to go and listen to that world. That was the justice world. And since we have started to talk to justice people, it has been a huge eye-opener for me, and I think for all involved. But I don't talk today about Just Culture. I would like to remain on the level of the topic of the panel, and I have taken a provocative statement here to say whenever the human comes in is what the automation can't do. So that's one of the statements which is a provocative statement to start my presentation. Yeah, and I would like to warn you, you're going to be part of my own test today. We're talking about automation, and I thought, well, I should be doing an automated presentation. Okay, shall I do, I had started to do a fully automated presentation where I'd have been here now and click, and the voice would have come and you would have listened to me, but I would haven't done anything. So I just decided it's not very nice, could be a bit annoying, people will fall asleep and so on. So to keep you awake, I've played with myself, I'm going to play with you as well, in the sense that I have timed the slides. They move on, but I have forgotten to write down how many seconds I have per slide. So it will be, I will be talking to the slides, but I really don't know when they move on. That's for you warning, okay? I hope the message still gets across. That will be the thing. So a little bit of history. In 2003, a few bold people met somewhere in France in an abbey and discussed the future of air traffic management, and in particular, the automation of it. These people came from various places around the world, and in the discussions, we came to what we called the 10 Commandments for Air Traffic Control Automation. I don't want to read them out, each of them, because I don't know how many seconds I have, but you have them in your conference package. So these 10 Commandments are still there. They are still part of the CESAR operational concept. Don't forget that. These people who were in 2003 talking about these things have also heavily influenced what we see still as the roadmap, if you wish, of César. So when we talk about automation, a few examples, what we say housekeeping, so the things we have to do every day in our work, and which have been automated. You see on the left-hand side a flight strip updating tool. That's not fully automated. That's the early start of automation where you represent a strip, a paper strip, in electronic form. In the middle, you have a frequency change. I hope you see that. There is a red thing. So automatically designed by the system, the frequency comes on. I have to go back here. Sorry, I'm cheating. I shouldn't be allowed to cheat. Then in Pecha Kucha, for those who know that, you have 20 seconds per slide, and that's it, and it goes on. So it's impitoyable, as we call it. But I think I come back to the frequency change. So here we have something which the system tells you, you have to do something. It's in the red. And to the far right, it's the only automated tool, fully automated tool I have in my working environment currently. That means it's transmission of the flight plan to the next sector. It has a what-if functionality. I don't do anything. It goes on. So now I've taken too long. I continue. More advanced automation in conflict, in ATM. What I have on the left-hand side is a sector where I control. On the right-hand side, I don't know how far you can see that, I have a list. And it tells me in 6 minutes, I have 1.5 nautical miles between, on the left-hand side, EN40 Golf and the Lufthansa 94 Charlie. You see the yellow crosses showing where the crossing point will be. Okay, now the list just tells me you have something there. I'm cheating again. The list says you have something there. You have to act on it. But there you see I have plenty other conflicts as well, where I also have to act. So that's part of what we have currently in conflict detection. It's a tool which replaces my head. In the past, I had to do that with my head. And now we have something, the latest gadget down in ATM we have is, I see what the pilot sees in his cockpit. So the pilot selects something, and you have this line which says it's a Lufthansa 505, he's at 3,800,000 feet. If I clear him to 390, like in my example here, and he doesn't select that in his cockpit, I get an alarm, okay? So now I stick to the rules, I don't go back. Here, latest figure we have in automation is we don't talk anymore to the pilots, we send them messages, call them SMS or mail, and things like this. So I have now with a mouse which has 4 functions, I can send a message, it's uplinked. So that's the latest feature we have, CPDLC. I, as a controller, I'm very, very, as I said, privileged. I'm working in a modern air traffic control center in Geneva. So I love automation. This is just to show you what it does systemically speaking. It is not empirical, it's just to show. If the traffic is at 10, when you start to introduce automation, the workload goes down immediately, and it goes down to fully automated where you nearly have no workload anymore. Of course, we don't work with that. What we do is we increase traffic. So here you have the blue line in traffic going up. The workload is not going up as much, and the costs do reduce. To give you an example, when we introduced all these figures I showed you before, these gadgets and things like this, we increased the capacity by 30 to 40%. And we are still capable, instead of doing 19 aircraft, I can do up to 31 aircraft. Well, that was not prepared like this. So. Just to show you, the automation ran out of the system. Now, what do I do in a situation like this? And so I try to improvise. I don't know exactly what's happened. Black screen. Black screen, what do we do with that? I still have a radio. Some people have no radio. And what I wanted to show with that is these are our challenges now. What if all this new automation, all this new technology, all these gadgets start to fail? What are our redundancies? How do we cope with that? And what do we say to aircraft? Look at your TCAS. Watch your TCAS, because that's your only life insurance. We can't help you anymore because we have no backup. I have put up here the latest failures. So you had in the US, in the early of the years, you had one of the center which was taken out of the air. You had in the UK, one of the biggest UK center taken out of the air. You have Spain, you have in Madrid, also the air traffic control center taken out of the air. And you have something very worrying from the security point of view. NATO did an exercise, and suddenly aircraft disappeared from the civilian screens. And nobody was informed, nobody knew what it was, things like this. And what do you do then in cases like this? So this is just to show that when we talk about automation, legal liability, these are topics which for us become really issues. And mind you, and Alfredo Roma mentioned that very nicely twice now, we are still in the 1990s when you look at the aircraft development. So aircraft of 1990s is what we have currently in air traffic management on the ground. So we are by far not in the fully automated systems like an Airbus 380 or a 787. We are still back at the early MD-11s or the 747-300s where you could push a few things which automate. So, but we are getting close to these things. System relevant failures, what do we do with that? What are our redundancy plan? How do we cope with that? I mentioned before when I asked you a question this morning about an ACC in Spain going down. They lost everything, radar, telephone, frequency, so they were basically a black spot. And suddenly somebody had a crazy idea and said, why should we not move to the training center, to the simulator? They have never done that, never done that. The simulator has not been really configured for that, and they managed to do it. But we can't rely, from a liability point of view, on such creative solutions in case something fails. So these are the challenges from our side. I would like to show you another case study. This is the Gol crash. Mid-air collision happened over Brazil, the Amazon, 154 people dead. A legacy aircraft, Embraer, did slit the 737 of Gol, low-cost airline in Brazil, and the Gol fell down. The legacy aircraft did manage to crash land on a military airfield. That was highly advertised because there was a journalist on board of the New York Times, and the two people who flew the aircraft were taken into custody in Brazil. There was a big issue, diplomatic issue, and so on. But what I wanted to show to you is issues where we have been involved, which need as well some sort of reflection of what we're doing. On the left-hand side, you have the Embraer cockpit with a little arrows showing you where the TCAS is, so Traffic Collision Avoidance System. I think for those who were here yesterday, you heard a little about that. And that system had an awkward issue that it went on standby without the pilots noticing it. So that was, by design, there was something new where the pilot could put his foot up there, touch a button, or you don't interrogate the transponder sufficiently enough because you are not on the radar coverage, and it goes in snooze mode. When it goes in snooze mode, it means for me, I don't see that aircraft anymore. It's over. It has never been there. It's gone. The Brazilian system, and these you see on the right-hand side, had another feature. Because they were covering such a huge part of the Amazon, they knew that they had at the limits of the radar coverage issues with really tracking the correct aircraft. So they built in a workaround, which was actually clever, which was fatal in this case, but which is clever. When the system detected that the aircraft was somewhere lost, it attributed to the label for the controller the altitude which the letter of agreement did foresee he has to be. So in this case, the aircraft was at 370, you see that, but actually the system attributed him 360, and then of course they hit. So what do you do then? The controller was jailed, the pilots were taken in custody and things like this, but the design issue, so for those who are flying to Brazil, the design issue has not been solved. Anyhow, but that's something else. Huh? So to conclude my presentation, Alfredo was so nice to talk about our policy. I don't want to go through that policy either, but I have distributed it. It says quite a lot of things, and we have also given the okay that it is being published on how do we see the future of the human in the system. We are part of the system for the time being. We don't foresee that we will be fully automated, so that there is a fully automated air traffic control system, so we have to be part of the loop. How you integrate that? We have a few global policy, which are recommendations for our members, which also I find interesting. In the Überlingen judgment, the court was looking for recommendations. So these are recommendations, non-binding. They're recommendation for technical professional recommendation. And the Überlingen court, in the judgment of Überlingen, took our global policy with regard to manning a sector, to use that as a global recommended professional activity, and with that then started to say, why is it that in the case of Überlingen you have one guy on his own without having support and things like this. So that's also maybe to frame a little bit what this policy is. It is for our members, but it has been used in legal proceeding, in particular in the Überlingen judgment. That's what I wanted to say. Thanks.
Vielen Dank, Mark, for your presentation. It's quite interesting to listen to the voice of people who have our lives in their hands when we fly. It's enough to look at the application for smartphone flight radar to see how many aircraft are flying over our heads every day, and to understand how complicated, as Mark has told us, the procedures to avoid accident. Actually, I remember when I was in the high-level group in 2000 for the designing of a single European sky, that they threatened us with the danger that in the following year the air traffic control was not manageable for the congestion, especially in the terminal area. Probably the work of the air traffic controllers and the new technologies have overcome this problem, because in the end we have not experienced a real problem. Important what you raised, that is design liability or responsibility for new technologies. And finally, the importance of a perfect or high-level design of the technology for the efficiency of the traffic control. Now the last speaker comes from academia, and is Cinzia Ingrotocci of the University of Messina. Experience has shown that accidents are often preceded by incidents and deficiencies, revealing the existence of safety hazards. Safety information is therefore an important resource for the detection of potential safety hazard and accident prevention. The imposition on organizations of occurrence reporting obligations is therefore vitally important to prevent air accidents. Various categories of staff working in civil aviation should have appropriate tools to report hazards, and their protection should be guaranteed, although such guarantee will not exonerate these persons from their responsibilities. This means to promote safety culture through the spontaneous reporting of occurrences, anticipating the principle of a just culture. The first question is the fear of self-incrimination and the potential consequences in terms of prosecutions before judicial authorities will prevent this person from reporting occurrences. A balanced approach is certainly necessary to favor the cooperation between safety authorities and judicial authorities. The second question is the existing European Union regulations, in particular the last regulation 376 of this year, that will enter into force anyway in 2015, are they effective to proceed towards a just culture? Are they mandatory reports required by Article 4 a concrete step forward to a just culture? What are the legal consequences for failure to improving and implementing corrective and preventive measures? Cinzia, the floor is yours.
Okay. Good morning. First of all, I would like to thank the organizer for this invitation. And I prefer to start for the last question of Mr. Roma, because there is a clear connection between the responsibility for implementing rule and regulation at the organizational and public level, with liability that remain on the operator when something happened. There is a clear allocation of responsibility for safety management and oversights in public authority and organization under the international rule and regulation, and European too. With this? Okay. But despite this clear allocation, it is extremely complex to identify the fault at the management level in ugly automated system. So according to core decisions, if a human negligence is proven, the consequences in terms of liability usually fall on the frontline operator. This is not a problem of civil liability and compensation, because there is a clear regulation on the transport sector under Montreal Convention and so on. This is a problem of criminal prosecution, and for the criminal nature of punishment, normally the judge refers to an individual for liability. In this context, the position of the authority and management level is to implement the regulatory framework for the correction of failure in the design of complex system according to a compliance-based model. This aim is contained in the EU legislation, and I'm referring to the regulation concerning safety investigation 1996 of 2010 that explain that the content of recommendation is must be used to improve safety regulation, and also in the new occurrence report regulation 376 of 2014. But in any case, European legislation does not lay down the consequences of failing the actual obligation of implementation of appropriate countermeasures. In this context, I think that public regulation must clearly define the legal consequences arising when the information is not taken into proper consideration by institutional recipients and they don't enact the appropriate corrective and preventive actions required to address safety deficiencies according to the suggestion of reporting and recommendation. For instance, in the maritime field, in the aftermath of the Costa Concordia accident, IMO derived lesson learned for seafarers that include some preventive measure to avoid a new accident of the same. And now these measures are included in the SOLAS Convention and became mandatory from the June, I think, of this year. In this context, the centralization of many aspects of safety oversight and regulation in the hands of European institutions could be an element of simplification. The other problem, the other issue is to clarify the effect of the above-mentioned regulatory failure if proven, in the judicial evaluation of liability of frontline operators in terms of contributory negligence or exoneration in any case. This is strictly connected with the level of diligence requested by frontline operator. Why? Because, as is known, overregulation greatly reduces the scope of the discretion of individuals on the decision to be taken in the interest of safety. In an integrated system, every operator is required to act according to the rule applicable to activity within their sphere of responsibility and should have the legitimate expectation on the good performance of all other participants. Actually, it cannot control the correctness of the work of the other involved in the operation. But in the air transport, the situation is quite different because of the integration between activities and the level of skill and care required by air operators is increasing. In the case of aircraft accidents, domestic legal rulings have not hesitated in finding the front office operator as liable by operating a downsizing of the principle of self-responsibility and legitimate expectation on the correct behavior of others. And elaborating a special rule of duty for the front office operator, whereby they should refer their behavior to the conduct of others, in accordance with a prudent interaction principle, aimed at defining a system of multiple layers of security. To sum up, in air transport we can find that the performance of the operator is governed not only by the specific rule of conduct that directly concerns his task, but also by an additional general rule of care identified in the duty of prudent interaction. The leading case is the ATR 72 case. On the contrary, in the medical liability, for instance, according to Law Balduzzi, a person who practices a health profession that in carrying out his activity meet guidelines and best practices approved by scientific community is not be prosecuted for mere negligence if something happened. In this framework, we can welcome the provision contained in the Article 28, paragraph 8 of the new law decree 133 of 2014 that must be confirmed by the law, but at this moment this rule refers to the source of accountability of personnel who operate at the helm and pilots or aircraft and personnel, recalling all international and European and domestic regulation to make clear that the liability of frontline operator can arise only from a violation of a specific rule that foresee for that is a part of a procedure binding for this frontline operator. In any case, I think that liability could arise in normal situation exclusively when a violation of protocol is proven. When there is something more, when the frontline operator is called to make a decision, according to the new regulation on report occurrences, Member States should not institute proceeding or analysis in respect of a decision taken as part of the duty of a professional, which subsequently proved to have been erroneous or ineffective, but which, when they were taken and on the basis of information available at the time, were proportional and appropriate. In this case, to conclude for a decision of liability is necessary a gross negligence by the operator. Some consideration about promoting a just cultural environment. As we know, the European Regulation 1996 on safety investigation and the new regulation on occurrence reporting are very clear in considering the information contained in the report and in the report of the accident or incident and the occurrences report, just data to be used for improving safety regulation. But member state, for instance, member state under 376 regulation shall refrain from instituting proceeding in respect of unpremeditated or inadvertent infringement of the law which come to their attention only because they have been reported. This protection is not full in any case, because in case of willful misconduct or where there has been a manifest severe and serious disregard of an obvious risk and profound failure of professional responsibility to take such a care as is evidently required in the circumstances causing foreseeable damage to personal property or which seriously compromise the level of aviation safety, this protection could come down. And the same is under 1996 regulation, because the evidence collected during the safety investigation judicial court are prohibited to use this evidence. But if there is an important issue, if there is the necessity to use this information, the competent authority, that is judicial authority, can decide the release of these documents. So the problem is that on the one hand, we need a general effort of clarification of core notions such as diligence, prudence, precautionary approach, and gross negligence. That is a concept that are object of very different interpretation in a different country. We need also an harmonization regarding the conduct of criminal procedure. Because in Italy, for instance, we have a principle of mandatory prosecution that in other countries isn't, such as in France. Okay, just to finish, in the context of improving just culture environment, we need also a more clear clarification about very important interests that can justify a use of evidence collected during safety investigation, also for criminal or in general for different purposes. It's not possible to leave this decision to the court, in any case, or to the judicial authority, without any indication. Okay, is all. There is something more, but okay, I finished now.
Okay, thank you, Cinzia, for your report, recalling the various European regulations and norms that in the end they appear more as recommendations rather than a mandatory rules actually changing and going decisively towards a just culture. But it's already important that the European legislator starts talking about just culture. I also appreciate the fact that in the end you said that we need a more common definition of negligence and willful misconduct for a correct allocation of liability. So now we don't have very much time, but I open the discussion and the intervention for questions to be raised to the speakers. Thank you.
Just a question to Aerocontrol and EASA, because this I think is very important. We are talking about CESAR, so open skies. When does responsibility over the traffic control of the airline, of the airplane pass from Eurocontrol to the airport? So, I mean, when you are landing or taking off, obviously it's the airport in control. I don't think it's Eurocontrol that controls it. So which is the point when, because we were just looking with Giovanni, luckily didn't happen, the collision at Barcelona airport in July between the Aerolíneas Argentinas and the Russian plane. But what is the moment in which you say this depends, it depends on Eurocontrol and it depends on the airport? When is the technical moment when we can say we can shift control from one subject to another?
Thank you. Actually, at no moment is the responsibility of Eurocontrol because we do not control airplane, except for the Maastricht upper area control, except for Maastricht, which is a control center which belongs to Eurocontrol. Other than that, we do not control aircraft, and I would suggest in the vast majority of cases, neither does the airport. There is an air traffic control. Yes, there is an air navigation service provider at any point from the pushback of the airplane, so pretty much from the moment they close the doors to the moment they shut down the engines. Exactly who that provider is, it may belong to the airport. In one or two cases in Europe, it's the airport. Birmingham is a case in point where they will do that. But it doesn't matter. It is an air navigation service provider, and if it goes from one to another, if it goes, for example, from Switzerland to France, it's exactly the same as if it goes from the ground to the air, and that's very clear when the aircraft is transferred in the frequency, when the controller says contact the next center on that field, this will not change. This will not change, and I think Mark can complement that.
It's still ICAO. ICAO is state responsibility, Chicago Convention, Article 28, and all these things, so it stays with the state. Single European Sky is state responsibility. Whoever does the undertaking of providing air traffic control on the ground is its state responsibility. And I mentioned before Überlingen, very interesting case also, who is responsible in the end. The fact that the Swiss air navigation service provider who caused the accident did intervene on German territory, so the physical location of the crash was over German territory, and because the German and the Swiss state did not clarify with a bilateral agreement at that time who is responsible for providing the service, so the oversight authority was agreed by, and I think you can help me, one of the courts in Germany, one of the higher courts, confirmed that it was German state responsibility to oversee the Swiss air navigation service provider who was providing air traffic control over German territory. Being an isolated small country, we do a lot of air traffic control around France and Italy, but all these things have been regulated through a bilateral agreement, except with Germany. So it's maybe also interesting for your question.
Yes, thank you, Mark. Actually, that is a very crucial point because despite, in the case of Überlingen, the control was made by the Swiss, they were delegated by the German authorities, and it is in practice the German state that cannot give up the liability linked to the sovereignty over its territory. And that is the other point that at the moment is impeding to arrive to the single European sky, because when we have one control center that covers various countries, some countries, they have to give up the sovereignty on their territory. And that is not an easy game.
I would I would say, if I mean, that's the case with Maastricht. So in that case, it was an issue between two sovereign states. In the case of Maastricht, it's an issue between sovereign states and an international organization. Exactly. And controllers, which may have any nationality, including an Australian. We have an Australian controller in Maastricht, and they control aircraft over the territories of Belgium, Luxembourg, Netherlands, and Germany. Right. What exactly is the liability? Only God knows.
Good morning. I have a question with respect to the liability of the suppliers of the main component of the aircraft, of the component which may be safety critical, let's say, for example, an engine or a software. How is it addressed? And is there any case law with respect to this kind of liability? Because normally the supplier of the main components, such as I said, the engine, at the contractual level, they tend to exclude every kind of liability to the maximum degree. So when an aircraft crashes, sometimes it may due to the failure of a safety critical component. So based on the principle of liability, normally the operator and then the manufacturer, but the integrator are sued. So how can we go back to sue such suppliers?
Maybe Marcello or Carmelo, you have to help me here. Huh? I'm not a lawyer, I'm an air traffic controller. There is, for you cases you're asking for, we have Concorde, where there seems to be something going towards the American company, but it can be as well what you said this morning, go for there where there's biggest pocket. It can be as well, because the issue of the Concorde, if you look, the incidents they had before is independent of what caused actually the accident. Anyhow, then there is Mont-Saint-Odile, for those who are a little bit familiar, Air Inter at the time, I don't know, 92, 93, where the French court tried to find the engineers who were working to develop one of the products in the aircraft which didn't work according to what was expected. And there is also Ubelingen, where there's a forum shopping, if I may use your expression this morning, still ongoing on Honeywell and Bull, because there is a TCAS issue in all this. So there is part of the civil and penal cases still looking if they could get a forum somewhere where Honeywell, because involved, could be charged. But I see that you might be able to help me more, Carmelo, no? Or, sorry.
I would add that actually the Montreal Convention, coming from the Warsaw Convention, provides for a strict liability of the airline. Then it will be the airline that will make recourse against the engine producer or any other part of the aircraft that has caused that. So as far as the damage is concerned and the people that suffered the loss or the damage, they have to sue the airline, because that is the simple way to solve the problem, and then the airline will make recourse on the producer.
Back to Mark, I enjoyed your presentation, stressing that we need a man on the loop, even for your presentation. Back to the design problem with the Brazilian air traffic security system. I would like to know more about this case. First, do you know if the Brazilian authorities determined who was responsible for that failure? And well, that could be a good point. and further technical details in order to understand the case even from a legal point of view.
I mean, I can give you plenty of this information. The issue is only that it might be a bit too much for the timing we have. But mind you, it is very, for us at least, as a representative of the controllers, it was very difficult, the Brazilian case, because the ones who are providing air traffic control are the military. So they are all soldiers or sergeants. And all the unit who was at work, and you might be laughing, we didn't find that funny, that day were transferred to the army. And they had to go and run 20 kilometers and things like this, but they were air traffic controllers because it happened in their shift. So that was the reaction at that time. And then you have, of course, plenty of other things involved, like the military buying the products with their own private companies and adapting it to the Brazilian system, which actually the product was correct, but it had to be adapted to their own thing because it had to be sold through their own companies. And then the legal system, being a military legal system coming in, using a civil investigation, and so on and so forth. So there's also plenty political pressure which was in there. So it's from a purely legal point of view, it is maybe a bit perverted but that's my own opinion. Huh?
But the final outcome, political outcome of the scandal?
They are still military. They are still using the same system. They have reinstated 2 out of the 10 who have been fired as controllers, and they have replaced the whole unit by young people who were not in the system. So to cope with the football, FIFA, and the Olympics, the system is not doing that bad, but yeah, it has still a lot of traps inherent in there. But that is also with other system. Huh? It's you're paying €6 every time you take an aircraft.
You're suggesting to go by train to the next Olympic Games.
Maybe. So, but if you are interested, I can give you some much more information on that in detail. Yeah.
I was just possibly a different perspective. I was thinking that, and I'm taking the point that Mr. Roman was mentioning before, that the European regulation are more recommendation to the private actors in this area. And I would like to understand, and possibly the academia would be more fit for the purpose. So I'm looking at Cinzia about how much the private actors, so meaning the actors that work in the field, are pushing the legislator towards the level of a higher level of safety, meaning that it is not the public actor that is understanding how much safety is needed, but it's the private actors, so the pilots association, the traffic controllers that are working in the field, and they are looking at the single conflicts that raise and what are the problems and how much the Brazilian system cannot speak to the I don't remember the other way of presenting the control, the air traffic control, how much these problem regarding the communication between system is pushing the legislator moving towards a different interpretation of the level of safety, and how much this is going to be in what is the selection, the criteria for the selection of one or the other system, the other, well, internal rules and regulation that are provided by private actors and included into the public regulation?
Very simple. ICAO is responsible for aviation in the world. They, of course, they issue recommendations, but they make controls and check all over the world to the civil aviation authorities through the local civil aviation authority to see whether their internal system is addressed to safety, because that is the first target of aviation is safety. Therefore, in addition, there are also regional offices of ICAO, like European Civil Aviation Conference in Paris. They also have a project that is called SAFA, that provides for control of the aviation legislation for each European country. There are 42 countries that are members of ACAC. So there are already, this is the structure that is already working on that. In addition, there are the national authorities that can provide also stricter rules for aviation, and the same for the European Union, that has, of course, a DG move that is interested in improving the safety of aviation in Europe. Filippo wants to make.
Yes, just if I may, 1 minute to say that currently in ICAO we have Annex 19 on the safety management, which establish only principles, but leave to the states to decide the tolerable or target level of safety, TLS. So it's the states in ICAO that should decide. Not in Europe, not in Europe. In Europe is the European Union, no longer Italy, France, Germany, okay. Unless Madame Le Pen wants to do something different, but for the moment even France is bound to Europe. And since 1985, the constant practice of the EU legislator has been to say how much all industry sectors should be saved is in the form of essential requirements attached to regulations or directives adopted by Parliament and Council. So it's not a technical matter how much we should be safe, it's a societal matter which in Europe is decided by those people which we have elected and that represent all of us. And these essential requirements are never obligation of results in terms of probability of an accident, because then who is responsible? But in terms of obligation of means, what each individual and organization should do. My contribution.
Thank you, Filippo, for precising all this. Giovanni, you want to?
Seems to me also for what Judge Gori said that we are broadening a lot the notion of causation. Whenever something, a different behavior or a different choice could have avoided an accident, then the person who had the possibility of taking the choice has caused the accident. Which seems to go very far away from the idea that by complying with a set of behaviors, then you avoid liability. So I was wondering whether the judicial approach and the regulator's approach are merging. And then the second point would be, if causation is so broad, then maybe what matters, at least for excluding individual liability and meeting the safety culture, is the idea that only for, we said, from gross negligence or for recklessness or intentional damage, there should be at least criminal liability, but also civil liability for individual operators. Do you think that, I would like to ask in particular Judge Gori, if this is where he thinks that our legal system, the European legal system, is moving to or not, and also in connection with the idea that complying with regulations should exclude liability. This is the other matter that I would like to put to you.
Yeah, very briefly, thank you for the question, Professor Sartora and Filippo. I don't know the family name, however. I think I cannot give in few seconds an answer for the whole European regulatory framework. I would say that within the Italian legislation, there is room for improving, of course, and to work on the causal nexus in particular. However, for the moment, judges just apply the law. I would rather say that a common culture involving aspects of just culture, like Mr. Baumgartner underlined, could be maybe important even now to improve, for example, in the assessment of the effects of the sentence, and to find how, for example, I would say the conduct of the person involved after the accident plays an important role in making authorities aware of security aspects. Of course, this is working not on the causal nexus or the culpability of the conduct, but could be very important for the person involved, reducing substantially the sentence effect. For more specific working effects on the causal nexus, I think that really a regulatory rethinking is important. Yeah, I would just underline this aspect.
Thank you, Pierpaolo. Well, we conclude this panel with a market observation. Unfortunately, the competition between the low-cost carriers and legacy carriers have produced a quite big crisis in many legacy carriers. And some of them, even the big ones, have come to the same decision of low-cost carriers, for example, to carry only the fuel necessary for the route that they have to cover and for an alternative airport. Instead, what they did before, to fill the fuels, the reservoir for the full fuel. And that is a dangerous practice that I'm afraid it will involve also other decisions or expenditure for safety of the air transport. This is the market situation. So I draw your attention also to this market situation that is worrying very much the European Commission at the moment, trying to see what they can do to facilitate the consolidation of European airlines or to reduce these dangerous practices. I thank you, I thank very much of the panelists for their contribution, and all of you for the contribution to the further discussion. Now we have lunch. Thank you again.